Hey, good morning, Facebook. This is Jim Blythe. We're here for you with Veterans Impact Show. Joining me today, author, historian, naval helicopter SAR pilot, Vietnam, great friend Marc Liebman. Welcome aboard. Welcome to the Veterans Impact Show, where our motto is Charlie Mike. Continue the mission. I'm your host, Jim Blythe, U.S. Navy Vietnam veteran and certified senior advisor. Join me as we feature veterans who continue the mission of leadership and commitment in our communities after serving our great nation. Why, you never know who you're going to meet or where we're going to go. So welcome aboard. Hey, today is a great day. And while this program is rebroadcast through DBTV Network next weekend, this is Memorial Weekend. And I want to say for those who are watching us live and will see it on Facebook and YouTube, thank you for being on board and thank you for remembering. But the most important thing when we talk about Memorial Day and remembering, I'd like for you to think about the Gold Star families because every day is a Memorial Day for them. Every day is a remembrance day for them. So let's pray for our Gold Star families. Now, Marc, welcome aboard. And man, it is always, we do this about once a month, and I learned so much. So today, I'm going to sit back and number one, this is the great Marc Liebman, tremendous author. His sales series is just amazing, historical. His two books that I love about Vietnam, Big Mother 40 and Cherubs 2. I'm sorry, I'm not 100% because I had a medical procedure yesterday on my heart and it went great. I had an angiogram, went fantastic. Actually, I'm better off now than I was before. No stents, no nothing. And I'll tell you about it later if you want to find out what I did. But Marc, I'm not 100% today. Let's start off. We want to talk about D-Day, but you have a bunch of information because of your research. Tell us about where we're going with this, been leading up to D-Day.
Okay, but before I begin, I want to let everybody know that Congress has passed a bill that encourages, and this was done years ago, that encourages us as U.S. citizens and citizens of allied nations that on the fourth Monday in May at 3 p.m., we all take a moment to remember those who paid the ultimate sacrifice to this great country.
Absolutely.
And I do it every Memorial Day. It's at 3 o'clock. Basically, stop what you're doing and just think about those who made this country free. And it literally goes back to 1775 when we started, and when the United States decided, or actually the Patriots decided to take on the most powerful nation in the world.
You know, Marc, what I do, I have a list, and I don't have it remembered. I remember ranking, but I have a list of the 12 pilots that my squadron lost in Vietnam, in the skies over North Vietnam. And I read that list quietly. But yes, it's important. But again, I think what's really, really important, yes, we remember, but we need to be focused on, in my opinion, the Gold Star families, because they are those survivors.
They gave the most precious thing they have, which is one of their sons or daughters, to keep us free and to serve this country. When people ask me, I'm wearing a hat and it says Vietnam Desert Storm Veteran, they say, thank you for service. I always tell them, and this sometimes blows people's mind, it was both an honor to serve and a privilege, because not everybody gets to do it. And it was my pleasure and honor to serve this great country. So let's start with D-Day.
Yeah, let's start with D-Day.
Okay,
what led up to D-Day?
Okay, so let's kind of go back to the beginning, because D-Day didn't just happen. A bunch of officers didn't sit in the back room for a year and put together D-Day. They had lots and lots of input and lots of lessons learned. So just to give you an idea, there are about 10 invasions in just the European continent or North Africa that occurred in the European theater.
he told that story. So my father was in Iceland and was part of this
Cool.
in 1941.
So I'm just gonna highlight a couple of these invasions and then talk very briefly about the invasions of the Pacific and then the lessons learned that came out of that. So the next thing that happened, the British went into northern Norway. Why? Because there's iron ore that's being mined in Sweden and it was being shipped to Germany from Norwegian ports. So the Brits took Narvik and Tromsø, Narvik, and a couple of places, along with the French, in the spring and summer of 1940. They decided to evacuate because they realized that sustaining it was unsustainable. It was they physically couldn't do it against the German forces, even after Norway fell. Then, of course, you have North Africa in 1942, which led to the eviction of the Africa Corps, and then Sicily and Salerno and Anzio in January 44. That's 7 in just the European theater of operations.
Let me ask you a question. The one for Sicily, that was a maritime invasion. So was the one in North Africa. They all are. But that was a really tough one in Sicily. A lot of times D-Day in Normandy, everybody thinks about that, but you don't think about, boy, that was a rough deal they did taking Sicily.
Yes, it was. And again, when they went into North Africa, and if you look at the timeline, North Africa is November 42. We had this raid in a place called Dieppe in France where they decided to try to see, it's kind of a test. We got our clocks clean. There's lots of lessons learned that came out of Dieppe, but we had 5,000 POWs and casualties from that little episode. Sicily happened in July 43. It's followed very quickly by Salerno and then Anzio. In the Pacific, there were 10 between December 41 and June 44, starting with Guadalcanal. And that battle lasted 6 months. There was many naval battles. Anyway, so there was Chosul, which is an island, New Georgia, Russell. I'm just going to rattle these off. Tara, Bougainville, Atiape in New Guinea, Hollandia, Sarmi, and Biak. So that's 10. So the point about this is while the Allies were planning Normandy, they had lots of lessons learned from them. So here's just some of the ones that were absolutely critical to the success of Normandy. Number one is they had to have control of the sea and the air over the beaches and be able to sustain it. Number two is sustaining a beachhead is harder than gaining a foothold. In other words, you can put people ashore, but you got to expand it or else they're going to get overrun. And that requires reinforcements. It requires supplies, food, everything. Okay. Gas,
logistics,
the logistics of it. And I hate to say this, and I'm going to brag about the U.S. military, but particularly the Army, nobody does logistics better than the United States. And then the other thing is that carriers can provide air cover and sustainability, or the fleet can, but you don't want to use them in confined areas. The English Channel happens to be what would be considered a confined area. We learned that ugly lesson off the beaches of Salerno and Anzio. We tried to use escort carriers, didn't work. But when we did it in North Africa, the U.S. Navy, 5 carriers, Ranger plus 4 Jeep carriers or escort carriers, provided the air cover for the American forces for 5 days until they captured an airfield, got it ready, flew airplanes from off one of the carriers and also from Gibraltar. So the next thing is that ports are not good places to attack. Why? Because they're generally heavily defended. B, they don't usually have beaches or places where you can land easily and get stuff ashore quickly. You want to capture a port pretty quickly, but you want to you need a beach to get the supplies over. And that requires a whole new set of technology, ships, and techniques, all of which were developed in these invasions that I listed before, long before we went into Normandy. So the Allied leaders that were planning this thing had a lot of things that that's lesson learned. For example, nobody pays attention to this, but the Marines have perfected this idea of what they call a combat load. The combat load is you load the stores on the ship in the reverse of how they're of what they're going to need. In other words, so you put the first things you're going to need, you put them on last, and the things you probably won't need later first. Well, that came out of the mess that was at Guadalcanal, because a lot of the critical stores were still on the ships when the Navy made the decision to pull out due to the threat from the Japanese Navy. That's a whole nother story I don't want to get into, but that's one of the lessons learned. And then the last one was night assaults, night beachhead landings are not a good idea.
Yeah, they can't see.
You can't see. Navigation is hard. So most of these invasions happen right around dawn. So we dropped paratroopers in Sicily in the dark. We had more casualties due to the drop than we did to the combat initially. We dropped the paratroopers in at night in Normandy. We had a lot of problems caused by weather, caused by navigation issues, caused by enemy fire. So the next airborne attacks were all in the daylight at dawn. Guess why? You can see where you're going.
You can see where you're going.
And you can put people in the drop zones. So anyway, so those are some of the lessons learned. I want to now go back and I want to talk about what's known in operational planning as the tyranny of distance. So Europe is a lot closer to the East Coast of the United States than a place called Australia or any place we fought in the Pacific. So just to give you an idea, there's a wonderful publication I use all the time in my writing called ports.com. I actually have the file downloaded and the link on my computer. So if you are on a ship in Los Angeles and you want to sail to Brisbane, Australia, which is the northeastern part of Australia, it's, oh, by the way, 18,887 sea miles. That's 18,887. So if you sail at 8 knots, which is a generous speed for most convoys, it will take you 98 days, i.e. 3 months. If you go at 10 knots, it drops to 79 days. So just think about this. This is part of the problems that the U.S. Navy overcame in the fight in the Pacific. And by the way, it was predominantly a U.S. Navy campaign until the late 40s. Yes, we had Australian and New Zealand ships integrated with our forces, but in terms of numbers, there weren't much. The British Pacific Fleet finally was able to participate in late 1944, and they did yeoman's work. They were great. And we had a separate task force. But for the predominant part of the war in the Pacific, it was the U.S. Navy show. And we perfected how to sustain not one, not two, but 3 fleets at sea in combat operations for sustained periods of time. And that included airstrikes, raids on the Japanese home islands or other facilities. That was called Formosa. Now we call it Taiwan, the Philippines, et cetera, et cetera. And, oh, by the way, conduct landing operations in the Central Pacific and the Southwest Pacific. So contrast that 18,887 miles with the distance from New York to Liverpool, England. Okay. Again, you're in a ship, you're getting ready to sail. If you go at 8 knots, that's 3,471 miles. In other words, 1/6 of the distance, roughly. It takes 18 days. And at 10 knots, it's 14.5 days. The actual sailing times for the convoys were a little less than that because, but by the time, again, the question is, where do you call a start point when he pulls out of harbor and then the convoy forms up, which typically takes a day. But the fact of the matter is the distance was a lot shorter. It was less than 50 miles from the south coast of England to the invasion beaches in Normandy. 50 miles, which means you don't need carriers, because you can fly back and forth. But the fact of the matter is we had to get the troops and the equipment and the sustainability supplies to England from the United States or North America. And that's everything. And we had to build it up. And it only went by sea, which means the Battle of the Atlantic, which is the longest battle of World War II, started September 1st, 1939, and ended on May 6th when the Germans agreed to surrender. It is not the longest, but it was also the costliest. 65,000 Allied merchant and naval sailors perished in that.
65,000.
65,000.
That's the Merchant Marine and
Navy.
The U.S. Navy.
U.S. Navy, Royal Navy, French Navy.
Wow.
Yeah, it was pretty ugly. So the fact of the matter is the Battle of the Atlantic was the most critical battle of World War II, because had we not won it, the D-Day would never have happened. So let me go back. So World War I, okay, the Brits fought the battle, and we fought the Battle of the Atlantic starting in 1917 when we joined the war. And that was crucial. Why? Because back in those days, we didn't have airplanes. We could fly stuff across the pond. And so we had to bring over 1 million men from the East Coast of the United States to France to fight in France and Belgium. And that was absolutely critical. And so what had to come with them was supplies. And then when you look at my generation, the most critical battle for any war in Europe with the Soviet Union before it fell apart, and even today now with the war in Ukraine, guess what? It's control of the Atlantic. Because we used to call it the Atlantic Bridge, it's what NATO's term for it. But without the Atlantic Bridge, or without the control of the Atlantic to bring supplies from North America to Europe, NATO would not be able to sustain a war. Guess what? We're seeing that in the Ukraine again today. So the question is how did we win? Because there's several phases of the Battle of the Atlantic. So in the beginning, when the war started, the Germans didn't have enough U-boats. It wasn't until 1941 that they had lots of U-boats. And that's when they call the first happy time. And they were sinking ships left and right at a rate that the Allies could not sustain it. The U.S. began building Liberty ships, being able to turn them out, pop one every 30 days. And so that began to build the shipping. I hear music in the...
Yeah, we're going to take a break in just a second. Hey, when we come back, we're talking about history. One of the things is you learn from history. If you don't understand history, you could very well repeat it, and that's no fun. So we're talking about D-Day as part of a Memorial Day celebration, not only remembering, but learning from the past. So this is Jim Blythe with Captain Marc Liebman. We are your host and your team today on the Veterans Impact Show. We're here for you. Share this. Get it out there. Let your kids listen to it because they need to hear the history. The United States is a maritime nation. Welcome back to the Veterans Impact Show, and thanks to our sponsors, Fairway Independent Mortgage and Lone Star Wealth Strategies. Now, let's continue this great conversation. Hey, this is Jim Blythe. Thank you for being on board. I got to give a quick shout out to my company, Fairway Independent Mortgage. Thank you for all you do. It's a faith-based company. Let me tell you, we're the largest non-bank mortgage company in the nation. I'm a reverse mortgage specialist, and we're here for you to help you not only get into that home, but help you with retirement, help you sustain your home ownership. And there is nothing better, in my opinion, for stabilizing a family than owning a home. And the VA, the Veterans Administration, has the best possible loan for anybody. And the only way you get there is to be a veteran. So thank you. And my MLS number is 311548, and the corporate one is 2289. And I'm thankful to be here. So, Marc, getting that out of the way, we're talking really about the Battle of the Atlantic, the sustainability, the planning that went into D-Day. There were 4,400 Allied troops killed on D-Day.
Yep.
And then when you think about it, it went on from there. And it was the 101st and the 82nd Airborne. My Uncle John was in the 82nd. And they went all the way. They were in Bastogne. They went all the way to Berlin.
So he got to walk across Central Europe. People take that hike now, and they actually pay money to do that.
Well, Uncle John got paid, but not a whole lot.
Yeah, but there's things flying through the air at you that kind of ruin your whole day. Could ruin your whole day.
But the important thing was, in order to stop Germany, in order to stop the Nazis, we had to take out their ability to make war. In order to do that, given the culture and the technology that we had at that time, we had to get onto Europe's soil. We had to get started. The battle going up the boot of Italy was pretty rough.
Pretty ugly.
Pretty ugly. The battle across France was not friendly either. But don't you think, too, with all of these things that were happening, and the Russian front as well, Germany was being weakened, but they were also getting more desperate and doing things like the V-2 rockets and the other things.
So let's come back to that, okay? I want to finish the point about the Battle of the Atlantic, because the Battle of the Atlantic was won, and was not only a war at sea, sinking U-boats, fighting surface raiders, stuff like that. It was also a battle of technology. And the Allies developed, perfected radar, direction finding, They came with better sonar, better weapons, a thing called the homing torpedo. And the Germans, by the way, developed one also. Whose is better? We can have that conversation. We developed new tactics, and we also deployed new kinds of ships called escort carriers. So all that ultimately suppresses. And the significance is by November of 43, the Battle of the Atlantic, I won't say was completely won. It wasn't a pacified lake, but we moved the entire invasion force from the east coast of the United States, primarily the Norfolk area, Baltimore. Well, that's Baltimore, Norfolk, the east coast of the United States, to the North African beaches, and we didn't lose a ship.
Really?
Yeah, it's kind of amazing. So,
literally, when you're talking about Normandy, it started in 1941.
Yeah, because until you win the Battle of the Atlantic, you can't have any war in Western Europe. It just can't happen because you don't have because the British economy couldn't sustain it. They didn't have you had to import things like fuel. You had to import things like specialty metals or metals ores. It didn't have the people. I mean, it just couldn't happen unless you win the Battle of the Atlantic. So the next thing, I'll come back to one of the lessons learned, is air supremacy over the invasion beaches. We did it three ways. One, we turned loose the bombers to penetrate into Germany, bomb German munitions, bomb cities. Did it work? Yes and no. It worked in the fact that it forced the Luftwaffe back into Belgium and central Germany to defend the homeland, which meant that a lot of the squadrons were pulled back from France, which meant because they were a distance from the beaches, that meant they had to take off, fly to the beaches, and then it had limited fuel, and then they had to fly back to their home bases. So the strategic bombing effort contributed in that way, plus the fact it did disrupt to some degree their war material effort. But the most important part of the air campaign was the destruction of what we call the infrastructure, bridges, roads, and railroads. So in other words, we bombed every rail yard in northern France. We bombed bridges, we bombed road junctions and stuff like this. This was done generally by what they call the tactical air forces, medium bombers like the B-25, B-26, the A-20.
A-26?
Not till later, but yes.
Yeah.
And single seat fighters like the Typhoon, the P-47. So that was that part of it. Then the third part of it was the fact that we had maintained fighter aircraft with the legs or the range to fly and patrol over northern France. So
now that was a P-51 Mustang.
The P-51 Mustang, much to most people's surprise, did not fly its first combat mission in the United States Army Air Forces until December 44.
Oh, really? It was that late?
December 43.
Oh.
Yeah, it was late. And we didn't see them in any effect until the spring of 44. So the bulk of it was done by the P-47, P-38s, and the British fighters. But my point about this is that we had enough airplanes, which guess what, got there by boat, and the fuel and the weapons to essentially run rampant over northern France and western Belgium. And so the Germans really didn't know where we were going. They were just essentially shooting up whatever they could find. So that gave us air supremacy over the beaches, and we had a air cover over not only the landing force but over the beaches, and literally we were cycling airplanes from the coast of England.
Now, may I ask a question? We had the manufacturing going on. I mean, you see photographs of B-17s, B-25s being built in Ford factories here in the United States. We were supplying and shipping things like crazy, but we were also crippling the German ability to make weapons, make aircraft and all. We weren't?
No. German aircraft production actually increased in 1944.
Okay.
They were building more Me-109s than they ever had, and more FW-190s. There were some airplanes that were, they changed priorities, but the Germans were able to build stuff. The real Achilles heel of the German military was fuel, because we were attacking the oil fields in Romania, which is where they got most of their gas. They went to synthetic fuels.
All right, let's take a break real quick. I'm sorry. He gets carried away. I love it because I love history. We'll be right back after these words. Thank you. Welcome back to the Veterans Impact Show, and thanks to our sponsors, Fairway Independent Mortgage and Lone Star Wealth Strategies. Now, let's continue this great conversation. Okay, I'm enthralled. I'm having a history lesson that is really great. Some of the things I didn't know about. I'm U.S. Navy. I'm third generation Navy. Mark, you were a Navy SAR rescue pilot. Basically, what a lot of Americans don't realize is we are a maritime nation.
Yes, we are.
And without the Navy, we would have never been able to take Europe. We would have never been able to get rid of the Nazis. We could be speaking with a German accent right now. Oh, boy. And they didn't do the Jewish people any favors either. So let's continue this conversation. A question that I have was the surface attacks and protection provided by our destroyers and corvettes and ships at sea on the convoys, was it as effective, or was it a combination with the submarines? How did that play out?
The British perfected the convoy system, and I'm going to go back in history. The British actually perfected the convoy system in the 1740s.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, it's evolved over time. But your comment about we the United States are a maritime nation. If you think about our country, we are bordered on the west by the Pacific, the north by the Great Lakes, the south by the Gulf of Mexico, and the east by the Atlantic. There's the only stretch of land border is between the tip of Texas to San Diego, and from the Duluth, Minnesota, and up there on the western part of Lake Superior to the Pacific Ocean. While that's long distances, the majority of our border is water.
Maritime, yeah.
And this country was built. Its initial wealth was built on people who traded goods and were shipping them overseas. And that began in the 1600s. But anyway, so let me come back to this whole thing about making the invasion work. Okay, so I talked about the tactical thing, taking out the infrastructure. What this really did was it made it very difficult for the Wehrmacht to maneuver, to do it, to transit, to go anyplace, because they couldn't do it during daylight, because as soon as they got out on a road or into a field, somebody in an airplane would spot them, call in his friends, and they'd be attacked. So they would have to move at night, camouflage during the day. Well, camouflaging in a tank is not a trivial task. It takes a while.
And train.
And our train is the same thing. You can't really camouflage a train. So everything had to be done during night hours, and then you had to take off the camouflage, reform, move that at night. And again, you're doing this in the dark, because if you show lights, you're going to be located. So what the air supremacy over the beachhead or over France or northwestern France did was it made it very difficult for the Wehrmacht to move, and also would slow them down. And then yes, there were a lot of command decisions, but that the Germans made that were dumb. Some of them were forced upon them by circumstances. Some of them was forced upon them by deception. But you have to look at this in the context of the guys who are leading the invasion at the time. We have 100% accuracy 80 years later. And so when you look at some of the decisions, you go, what the hell were they thinking? But many of them were based, again, I go back to the lessons learned. So Nathan, pop up the slide on the invasion beaches. I don't want to talk about the route to France, not that one. That's okay. So this slide, and I hope the viewers can see this, shows the routes that the fleet took to the invasion beaches, and there were 5 of them. There's Utah, Omaha, Gold, Sword, and Juneau. And there were 2 covering forces, which were the ships that would provide naval gunfire. There were battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. There were the transports, and they had to get there. Well, during the war, I hate to say this, but both the British and the Germans heavily mined parts of the English Channel. Now, we knew the way through the Allied minefields, but we didn't know our way through the German minefields. And so the leading this thing were a bunch of wooden ships, literally, because they're not magnetic, called minesweepers, and they were were tasked to sweep the route into the invasion beaches, so the transports and the warships could follow to get close enough to do their thing. So amazingly enough, only a few of these minesweepers were sunk. They were the first casualties of D-Day.
But the other thing was they were also putting frogmen, UDT.
Yeah, I'm going to get to that.
Okay, come on.
All right. So this whole issue of clearing mines was really a 3-step process.
Mhm.
Process 1 is get everybody there. 2, we had to clear the beaches. Now we had lots and lots of photography of the beaches at low tide, but we didn't have the risk. And this was a decision made by the SHAPE, the Supreme Allied Expeditionary Force Commander, that we did not want to put men on the beach to do reconnaissance because it might give away the actual location. So I got it. So we had these things called, we just call them UDT because that's what they really came. They were Navy and Army guys trained in underwater demolitions. It was a technique and tactic that was being developed in the Pacific. The difference between the Pacific and the Atlantic in this case is the temperature of the water.
Oh, man, yeah.
So when you're going ashore at a place like Saipan or Peleliu, the water is 70 to 80 degrees. When you're going ashore in the English Channel in June, it's in the 50s.
Ugh.
It's cold.
Hypothermia.
Anyway, so these guys swam ashore ahead of the minesweepers, and 70% of them were killed. Once the invasion started. They did not get to do their job well. As it turns out, their failure was actually a success in the fact that many of the beach obstacles that they just were supposed to destroy became cover for the invading forces.
Really?
Yeah. It's an interesting thing. These guys did not die in vain. Now, there's a couple lessons learned that comes out of that, which is we can talk about. It's more or less beyond the scope of this. So the minesweepers go in, they clear the area, and they did this at night, okay? So that at first light, the invasion landing craft could go ashore. Well, one of the things that we didn't have a good handle on, again, because this is a decision made at the highest levels, is we didn't have a good handle on the tides and the currents to get, and so the currents drove the landing craft off their landed beaches. As it turns out, at Utah, it was a good thing because they landed in a place that wasn't heavily defended. At Omaha, it just was chaos because it was, if you've ever go to Normandy, and I highly recommend it, stand on the water's edge and the bunkers at each end of the beach, because the beach is kind of a shallow U, and there are bunkers at each end. They're still there. And stand there and imagine what it would be like to land on that water and charge towards from across the sand to the sand, the bluffs, the small bluffs that are there. It's about 200 yards.
And you're
under
just,
fire.
You're sitting duck or running duck. Maybe that would be a better.
Jogging, I think, is better because you're carrying 80 pounds of equipment. You just spent an hour in a landing craft being bounced around. Some of them were seasick. You're scared, and if you're not, I have doubts about your sanity, and nothing is going to plan. Nothing. When I say nothing, and I'm talking about the very tactical thing, the idea of getting to the draws, getting up through the draws, getting off the beach, capturing the German defenses from behind. Yes, we eventually did that, but in the first hours at Omaha, it was pretty ugly. But and then I come back to the leadership at what I call the NCO level in the U.S. military. This is a trait that our friends in the Russian army and in the Soviet army before them and the PRC have not mastered. The core of the U.S. military is, in fact, its NCOs. It's professional NCOs and it's JOs who are taught leadership from day one. We call them, they were known as 90-day wonders in those days. It was 90 days. They went from being a civilian to being a platoon leader, and they were taught leadership, tactics, and all that kind of stuff. And the other thing that Americans are known for is, and I will quote Admiral Dönitz after the war. He said, the one thing about fighting the U.S. Navy, it's a very difficult task because war is chaos, and the United States Navy practices chaos on a daily basis. But the fact of the matter is our soldiers, sailors, and Marines are taught to adapt, overcome, improvise, and overcome literally on a daily basis. And living at sea, you don't have everything you need, so you either have to make it or fix it, or you do without. This is essentially what happened on the beaches. So that plus naval gunfire, The destroyers literally got within a half mile of the beach. A couple of them wound up sucking sand into the intakes and the bottom of the ship for the cooling intakes for the boilers and stuff like this.
Now they were firing 5-inch 38s.
5-inch 38s, which is a wonderful weapon. The 5-inch 38 from World War II is probably the finest all-purpose gun ever made. It's the basic design we still use today. They've changed the barrel and they've changed the loading mechanism, but it's still the same 5-inch. And they were literally firing point blank. The cruisers and battleships that could shoot 8 to 10 miles inland, you can't use those things unless you can put eyeballs on the target, because the destructive power of a 2,000-pound bullet is pretty awesome.
Yeah.
And so you don't want to hit the good guys. So, but the destroyers literally were talking to a guy on the radio, said, shoot this bunker over here or drop some rounds over here. And they would literally give them the grid coordinates, and the destroyers would go boom, 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 boom. And suddenly you had, artillery landing on the German positions. So the naval gunfire support in the first 2-3 days of the invasion was absolutely critical until we got artillery ashore. So here's the other amazing thing to me. Between 6A or 532, I think is the time the invasion was supposed to land, on June 6th and June 7th, the United States and Allied navies, put 170,000 men on the beach.
Wow.
That includes tanks, artillery, supplies, blah, 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 blah. Within days, within a week, we had 500,000 men on the beach. We had a port built. We had fuel lines literally from the English shores running a couple hundred feet under the water all the way to the beaches, so you didn't have to use tankers. Okay,
Marc,
mean, it's
that'd
amazing.
be like taking a city the size of Waco, Texas, and transporting it.
Right.
Wow.
So you can't do this unless you have an effective Navy. And again, I come back to the lessons we learned in the invasions that led up to D-Day, because they were still making changes within a week of the actual invasion, because we kept learning things. Adapt and improvise. So then the last thing is this whole thing about close air support. It wasn't used enough or much until the invasion beaches were well secured and we began to get out of range of the Navy gunfire. And at which point the Navy's from a gunfire role was over. And by that time we had lots of people on the beach. We had close air support. We actually had airfields on that we could land and take off airplanes. But still, for the early days, for the first month or so, it was still coming out of the UK.
One of the questions that comes to my mind, if I did not know enough about the history, our aircraft carriers were in the Pacific.
All of them.
All of them.
Except the escort carriers.
We did not have the same aircraft and air cover in the Atlantic, in Europe, for these invasions that we did in the Pacific. Was there a reason for that, or is it just turned out that way? Or
it's a little bit of geography, and it's a little bit of it's mostly geography. So when you're attacking an island like Tarawa or Peleliu, it's relatively isolated.
Mm-hmm.
So you bring the carrier force in close, 25, 50 miles off the beach, and the carriers can have really free reign once they have knocked the Japanese, in this case, the Japanese aircraft out of the sky or destroy them on the ground. And reinforcements from the Japanese perspective had to come from someplace else. So they were then vulnerable. So essentially you isolated the island, and now you can attack it with the ground forces. And so the transports get within a mile or two of the beach and everybody goes ashore. The battles are shorter, violent, because the Japanese would not surrender. But then they were over. Europe was different. Okay. So one, we had to put a much bigger force on the island, because the island, so Peleliu had 10,000, 12,000 Japanese. Tarawa had 6,000 Japanese. So you're talking about a relatively small forces. Okinawa was much more like a European invasion, because there's 125,000 Japanese soldiers on the island. So Europe is a lot different. The Wehrmacht was much bigger. It had tanks, it had artillery, it had things that are much more effective than effective is not the right word, but different kind of force. So
it was a different battle.
It's a different type of
war.
battle. So again, in the English Channel, go back to the map again for a second. In that area between England, southern England, and the Cherbourg, it's relatively short. It's like, depending on where you go, it's 50, 100 miles. And to operate carriers just don't sit there. They steam at 20 knots to launch and recover airplanes. So you need carrier boxes. That place was full of mines. The naval supremacy, one of the things that we did was we affected but did not take out the German torpedo boats. The Allied invasion force was attacked by E-boats. We lost a couple ships to them. The submarines were pretty much suppressed. They didn't get into the invasion forces at all, but that's because of the destroyer screens on both sides of the invasion force, and aircraft looking for them. But to operate in that area with carriers is really ugly. So during Desert Storm, it took a command decision by the Chief of Naval Operations to move the carriers from the Indian Ocean, or it's called the Gulf of Oman, into the Arabian Gulf or the Persian Gulf. And when they moved them in, that enabled us to operate very close to Iraq and to Kuwait. But to put 4 carriers in that thing, we each had boxes, okay, in which the carriers operate. In other words, they steam, they launch aircraft, they recover aircraft. And so the way the Navy does it is pretty interesting. If you have 2 carriers, you have a day carrier and a night carrier. If you have 4 carriers, you have 2 day, 2 night. You may have some swing depending on what you want to do. But again, you need a fairly large area.
Well, like in the war against North Vietnam, we had all of the Gulf of Tonkin to work in.
Yes, and the carrier boxes were Yankee Station was roughly parallel or not off the DMZ.
Here's the interesting things that we're talking about, though. The lessons that were learned, starting with the invasions of North Africa, the invasions of Italy, all of these things were learned for Normandy. What we also learned in the Pacific, but we still are looking at some of that same philosophy and technology today if we had to do something like that.
Absolutely. So again, I said this before and I'll say it again. Any war in Europe requires control of the Atlantic by the Allies.
Including Ukraine.
Including Ukraine. Because guess how most of those munitions are getting there? They're getting there by boat.
All right, let's do this. We're going to take a break and come back. Thank you so much for being on board. Share with us. Join with us. This is Veterans Impact Show. We're here for you.
Oh, I go.
Welcome back to the Veterans Impact Show. And thanks to our sponsors, Fairway Independent Mortgage and Lone Star Wealth Strategies. Now, let's continue this great conversation. I got to tell you, this is a great history lesson. I think it's good, but you have to understand. If you don't understand history, you'll end up repeating it. Now, Mark, what were you saying? You're about to...
So I want to talk about the legacy of
D-Day. Please.
Not so much in terms of it launched the ground war that ultimately defeated Japan, but the lessons that the U.S. military and what eventually became NATO that we learned during the Pacific War and during D-Day are still with us today, and we still practice them. So let me fast forward to Korea, 1950. The Army did not do well. It was overwhelmed when the North Koreans invaded on June 25th, 1950. We're pushed down to the Pusan perimeter, and we are on the verge of being pushed off the Korean Peninsula. Now think about that for a second. That means we're going to be pushed off the theater of fighting, and we're going to have to do what's the Marines euphemistically call forcible entry to get back on the beach, so to speak. So we managed to hold the Pusan perimeter, and we did that. But guess why? Because the Navy still had a lot of ships from World War II. We brought them out of mothballs. We still had some reserve. We called up the reserves, and we managed to hold on by our fingernails in the Pusan. And then MacArthur came up with this brilliant idea. We're going to land at Incheon in the fall of 1950 against everybody's advice. But MacArthur had a lot of amphibious experience from World War II and his campaign in Southwest Asia that ultimately brought him to the Philippines. And a lot of the places he put troops ashore were not, if you look at it from the classical way of looking at amphibious landing areas, were not necessarily smart. So that we went into Incheon, and we literally cut the North Korean army off, and it essentially disintegrated. Most of its troops were captured. A few got away. They retreated north of Pyongyang, and the rest of the Korean War happened as it happened. We continued to use amphibious capabilities to launch raids up and down the Korean coast against the North Koreans and ultimately the Chinese. Today, every major Korean exercise that the U.S. participates in with the Koreans has some kind of amphibious operation in it. And the North Koreans know that. They fear, even today with our greatly reduced amphibious capability, the fact that the U.S. Navy can put a substantial force on the beach someplace in their territory to create a strategic advantage for the United States. The rest of the world understands that. Okay. And the British, again, when they got kicked out of the Falklands, had to do forcible entry. And because they had many of the lessons learned, they had to do what's called ships taken up from trade, which means they're taking civilian ships, converting them to military use, and basically sailing them in a convoy to retake the Falklands. But again, the lessons learned from an expertise, while it had all retired, but those lessons learned was in the Royal Navy's DNA. And by the way, the Royal Navy's DNA includes things like Dunkirk. It includes like supporting the British Army against Napoleon, supporting the British Army against us in the 1770s. The British Army knows that as long as they have a route to the sea, the Royal Navy will come get them. And that has been their tactics and strategy.
And the Royal Navy is there to supply them.
Correct.
And that's why probably at one point in time in history, you couldn't have the sun didn't set that it wasn't on a country in the British Empire.
Correct.
I may not be saying that correctly.
Sun doesn't set on the British Empire.
Right. And it was because they were a maritime nation.
Yeah. So let me come back to the lessons learned. So we now have we're now in the 2020s, and Taiwan, the People's Republic of China, is making noises about invading Taiwan. Understand that the PLA, People's Liberation Army, and the People's Liberation Army Navy, and the People's Liberation Army Air Force, because they're all under the PLA's banner, that's their chain of command, has not fought a war since 1979 when they invaded North Vietnam and got their clocks cleaned. And so now there are people who are talking heads are saying, "Oh yeah, they're going to invade Taiwan." Let me get this right. Here's an army that has zero experience doing amphibious operations. They're going to launch an invasion across 120 miles of open water against a well-armed, well-defended, hopefully well-led, and well-equipped Taiwanese military. And they're going to get a beachhead, and they're going to be able to sustain it. And once they do that, they're going to instantly drag in Korea, Japan, Australia, the Philippines, which now has an alliance with Japan and Taiwan, and the United States into a war that they cannot win. It would be long and ugly and bloody, but the fact of the matter is that anybody who has studied this, and including my friends in the U.S. military, have said the hardest part for the PLA is not going to be getting a beachhead, but sustaining it.
And this is a lesson learned. Okay.
Yes.
Mark, I want to say thank you for being on board and this fabulous history lesson. Share this. Make it a part of what you're teaching to young men and women today. I also want to say thank you so much for our Gold Star families. Thank you for remembering the men and women who gave it all, and especially for the families who gave it all when their son and daughter were gone. So what we're trying to do is show you the importance of the Navy, the importance of the lessons learned, but the importance of being able to sustain our freedom, because there are countries in the world that would destroy the United States. They're screaming, "Death to the United States." We've got to be strong. We have got to be strong. And that's where it's very important to be involved and to vote. I like to end our programs with a prayer. Lord God of the universe, we are so tremendously thankful for your hedge of protection around our active duty military around the world, soldiers, sailors, Air Force, Marines. Thank you, God, also for putting a hedge of protection around our first responders, those men and women who run into the fire instead of away from it. Dear God, I think it's important, regardless of our religion, regardless of our race, regardless of our beliefs, that we start working together as a nation, as a people, as people on this planet that believe in freedom. We need to work together. And so, dear God, we thank you for our veterans and pulling this nation together, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you, dear God. Amen.
Amen.